Hey there, and welcome to week 6 in Red Dirt Spirit's series on Paul's letter to the Ephesians. A couple of days ago, I was having a chat with a buddy of mine about my last couple of videos in this Ephesians series. And specifically, we were talking about this idea of God's lazy river, and we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. But that's just kind of become, the lazy river has become a bit of a helpful metaphor and analogy for how I think about what Jesus called the kingdom of God. And if you haven't seen those videos, basically the idea is that right at the moment of creation, what theologians call in the beginning and what scientists call the Big Bang, right at that initial moment, God sets forth his cosmic flow of divine, animating, and creative energy. And this is a flow of interrelational connectedness, of diversity, but oneness, of unity and love. It's not that this flow chooses to love, but this flow is love. This flow doesn't come into existence, it is existence. Or as philosopher Paul Tillich said, it's the ground of being itself. God, in that explosion of love and goodness and abundance and creative energy, he builds the cosmos, including the planet Earth and all of humanity. And while this river, this divine flow of peace and joy are deep and broad and surging all throughout creation, inside of that river, there also exists a choice, a freedom, and the ability to swim upstream, so to speak. Of course, the scriptures are telling the story of humanity from a theological perspective, and they say that while God's abundant river has been flowing from the beginning, there are also spiritual and human powers and structures that make decisions, that exercise their freedom to resist, to rebel, and to push back against this flow of God's river, this divine way of being. So this river metaphor is really close to my heart personally, and again, it's been helpful, at least for me. But my friend said that while he loved the imagery of God's river, he wondered where it might land for those who are currently experiencing a lot of suffering in their own lives, or maybe their children's lives. And to be honest, he's right. These are beautiful words and beautiful images, and they're really easy for me to say into a camera to people whose lives and stories I don't really know that well. But how do we find a way where these ideas can fit inside of a life or a world that is also experiencing pain and loss, grief and betrayal, or suffering day in and day out? The reality is, I don't know. And I can't fully know, especially for each of you sitting with your own set of unique circumstances. And I'm sorry, because I know that's really unsettling. Because often what we want is certainty and security and answers. And my incredible and amazing wife, Suze, and I, we can totally relate to that, especially her. I mean, she was diagnosed, you may not know this, but she was diagnosed with breast cancer back in 2015. And later in the year, after her surgeries, she had to spend 18 hours laboring to give birth to our little girl, Olivia Hope, who we had lost at 20 weeks. And that's when she said, "Look, Philip, I've got to go back home to be with my family," because she's here from Brisbane. And so we moved back here into Brisbane in 2016. And then in 2017, we had a little boy named Levi who brought us so much joy back into our lives. But right as he was about to turn 6 weeks old, we stood again in another doctor's office, me holding a little 6 week old and trying to manage our other then 4 and 3 year olds, as we heard another specialist tell us that the cancer had come back. They hadn't gotten it all the first time like they thought they had. But this time it was stage 4 and it was terminal. And we spent 2 months at the Royal Women's Hospital 5 days a week after that, so Suze could get the chemo and the radiation that she needed for her body to survive. And thank God that she's still here beyond everything that the stats said should have been. And we're grateful every single day that we have each other. And I'm so grateful that she's here, but reality is it's not guaranteed. The cancer, they're always happy to say, is dormant in her body. But they're also happy to remind us, it seems, that it also has a high chance of reactivating at any time. And we'd be right back in it again. And I don't tell you any of that to say, look, we figured out how to get through that and the key to happiness and health and wealth or anything like that. Some days it's still really scary and really tough. In our marriage and our family, we've taken some really brutal hits along the way. Some that have been completely out of our control, and others that were self-inflicted. Some that were inflicted by my own decisions in the process. The reality is this Jesus thing, it's not a get out of life or get out of suffering free card. Even though there are plenty of traditions and versions of Christianity and spirituality that like to talk and think that it is. I mean, think about it. We talked about this in the intro of this series, but Paul, the writer of these beautiful and inspiring words to these churches around Ephesus, he's writing them in chains, suffering as a prisoner of Rome. This guy is in literal lockdown. For years, he's in lockdown. For years, he's in prison. And not just at this point. If you go back into the book of Acts, this guy's life was riddled with difficulties. And in some wild and hard to grasp way, he still finds joy and honor inside of his weak and inside of his shameful situation. And this is crazy because humility, while we consider it a virtue now, humility was not a virtue in the Greco-Roman world. But for Paul, for Christ, for these little Christ communities, it was. And he even says that his imprisonment is actually for these churches' glory. In this realization, this apocalypse of the Christ, the powers of this age, those anti-currents in God's flow of love and unity, they have no choice but to loosen their grip. Why? Because all they have, the only tools they have to work with, these powers are violence and shame and fear. Violence and rage that comes up when someone impedes on our vision of the world. Shame that sits deep within us, eating away at us because of feelings of worthlessness and our need for approval from others. The fears and the anxieties that surround us around safety and security, and our own deep fears of isolation and loneliness and emptiness. It's these powers that Jesus confronts and defeats in his life and death at the violent hands of the Roman Empire. In that moment, the powers lost their vice grip because Jesus said, no, I will not play according to your rules of engagement, according to that way of being in the world. Jesus knows and knew what true power looked like, and he didn't resort to using conventional weapons of anger and violence. He wasn't fueled by grasping and clinging to his own life out of self-preservation. Jesus refuses to give in to the powers specifically by giving himself over to the powers. Through this, Jesus disarms the powers, not by retaliating with weapons of shame and anger and fear, but by emptying himself, by pouring himself out through a broken body of self-sacrificial love. And it's really important to say this, that in his death, Jesus doesn't ignore or resist or deny feelings of fear and shame, sorrow and grief. He feels and experiences them all. He does not run from them, but instead he moves directly into them and through them. He enters the worst that the powers of violence and wrath can conjure. He faces humanity's deepest, darkest fears on the cross. And in doing so, he frees himself from the vice grip of fear and control. He flips all of the dominating and grasping power systems on their heads. This is why Paul can sit in a prison cell and say it's a glorious position for him to be in chains. He knows that powerlessness is the beginning place for a truly Christ-like transformation. It's where, as we grieve and lament the loss of a child, the sickness of a spouse, the pain of divorce, the trauma of abuse, the failure of a business, it's in those moments of loss where paradoxically, that's where we're connected with the divine. It's here that we feel the humanity of Christ, who meets with us in our places of pain and suffering. And he comes and he says, yeah, that was me too. I suffered too. In that moment, we can begin to drop into these deep reservoirs of trust and love and compassion and joy and peace, precisely because we aren't alone. And yes, I truly believe that God is overflowing goodness and abundance. But again, it's subversive work. Look at what Paul says here in verse 16. He says, I pray out of his glorious riches that he might strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know that this love that surpasses all knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. So where does this power and strength take root? Paul says it takes root in their inner being. This is the reason I name my personal project of coaching in spiritual direction the inside job. Because the reality is, we can rearrange everything in our outer worlds, our health, our money, our careers. We can have success in all variety of ways. And I know we all know this, but we can have all that and still be completely wrecked and miserable in our inner life. Scholar Andrew Lincoln says that it's the inner life of a person that is the base of operations where the Spirit does his strengthening and renovating work. Experiencing suffering and loss is part of what it means to be human. And by the way, any theology or tradition that doesn't give and make space for grief and lament is not robust enough for the actual human experience with God. In lament, we're not simply airing our grievances and our complaints, or we're actually expressing that something is out of order in God's world. And in making room within ourselves for the reality of struggle and the reality of pain, it doesn't mean that we're becoming over-identified with it or victims of it, or that we're saying that suffering ultimately wins. Instead, it's expressing a deep trust that God, this ultimate relational dynamism of love and goodness, is holding me and is holding our beautiful little Olivia and is holding my wife and my whole family, and who I trust is also holding the broken, lonely, lost, and hurt of all of humanity, including you and your life. And in and through Christ is bringing all of our broken things back into unity. And this is what allows me, even inside of the suffering, to let go of my need for certainty, for security, for a fist-clenched control. And trust me, this kind of surrender, this is far from a passive disengagement from the world. Instead, it's abundantly active and abundantly intentional and empowering. This act of open-handed living, it subverts the false, self-defeating agendas of worldly power by fighting them with true power, the self-emptying, poured out, servant-hearted power of love. So for my friend and for any of you who are listening today, as we continue to explore these beautiful passages from Ephesians, we do it acknowledging and knowing the struggles of life. This is a life that Paul is going to go on to say is best lived and maybe only lived well inside of these communities of those who have also had this awakening to the Christ reality. And we're going to begin exploring Paul's vision for how that community life gets lived out next week in chapter 4. But for now, that's it for chapter 3. Grace and peace to you.